Got it.
Okay, I think we're good to go. Good job, everybody. Takes a team to conquer the IT we have to deal with, doesn't it? Anyways, I am happy to recognize all the guests that we have here today. I'll get to Nick in a minute, but I'd like to recognize Trish Collins. With Trish, can you wave to everybody? Trish is our executive director for ACWW, and she's joining us today from her home, but in London, England. So thank you, Trish. We have also from ACW office, Christine Rayburn. Christine is the secretary for ACWW. And unfortunately, we can't see Christine, but we know she's there. We've been trying to get her on screen there anyways, but we welcome you, Christine, for joining us. And we have our Canada area ACWW president, Linda Hoy. And Linda, can you wave at everybody there, down in there? And Linda is joining us today from Quebec. And again, thank you for coming on. And I know we have Judy Parks from Nova Scotia. And I don't know if is there anybody else visiting today from outside province that I may not know? If you do, wave and put your mic on, because we do want to welcome you. Okay, Doreen, yes?
Yeah, Doreen Wall from Prince Edward Island.
From Prince Edward Island, right. Welcome, Doreen. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so with that, we'd like to welcome Nick Newland. Nick, as Michelle has said, is the advocacy director, but he also has another role. He's also the chief privacy officer for ACWW, and that's a very big role, with privacy being a very important part of our organization. We have non-geo status with the United Nations, and that is a very special position we want to keep, and Nick is doing a great job. He's been with ACWW, I believe, for 7 years. You can correct me on that, Nick, if I'm wrong. And he's been very involved lately with dealing with Ukraine-Russian conflict. And he's here today to share with you the work that's being done on behalf of ACWW and all WI members. Whoops, I just saw somebody I forgot to mention. Margaret Bile, Canadian FWIO president. Welcome, Margaret. Can you wave? Sorry. Okay. Thank you. All right. So can everyone please put your mute button on, and welcome, Nick.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Michelle. It's great to be here this afternoon, and I do apologize now, as well as the 3 people outside screaming and shouting. The person above my hotel room seems to be doing aerobics, so if they fall through the ceiling and land on my lap, then we'll have to welcome them to the meeting as well. So I apologize if I'm momentarily distracted by the odd random noise. Yes, it's great to be with you this afternoon. I see some familiar faces from yesterday, and obviously I know some of you are board members fairly well. So I was asked to come and join you this afternoon to give you a bit of an update and an overview of what ACWW has been doing in the last few months relating to the invasion of Ukraine. It's not an easy situation, and obviously we, even as an international NGO with status at the UN, are limited in what we can do. You know, we don't have divisions of troops available, and we don't have unlimited ability to input an impact on the ground. But I wanted to give you a bit of an overview of what has been happening, and then also be very happy to take questions from anyone. If there's anyone here who wasn't here yesterday who wants to ask questions, please ask anything you like at all. And if there's anyone who was here yesterday and has heard me not exactly remember what I said, and so I've used slightly different words, and wants to ask questions, then I'm very happy to answer those as well. The only thing I will say is, obviously, it's a very difficult situation in Ukraine. And so there are some things that we are doing, and we are applying pressure, but we're being very careful to make sure that the first thing we do is protect people. So there may be situations where I can't go into much detail about what exactly I'm going to say, or answer a question precisely, but I will make that clear. So if anything I do say will be as much as I possibly can say. I thought I'd probably start as the most clear and cogent overview. If I start with the letter that was sent to members last week, possibly Wednesday, I can't now remember. As soon as I've switched time zones, I lose all ability to understand what day of the week it is. But I know I'm in Canada and I know it's Saturday. So I'm not entirely sure when this letter was sent, but that was sent by ACWW's world president to the membership. So I'll just start with that. So, dear ACWW members, having received contact from several members and societies around the world, I thought it would be helpful to clarify ACWW's position regarding the crisis in Ukraine. Firstly, ACWW is clear in its conviction that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is an illegal act of aggression, in line with Article 1, Article 2, Paragraph 4, Article 33, and Article 39 of the UN Charter, as well as the UN General Assembly Resolution 3314 and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. It is illegal to wage wars of territorial aggression, and it's illegal to invade another country without the sanction of the UN Security Council. So, as I said yesterday, there are some specific circumstances where the UN will say, actually, we want countries to make an intervention, but in general, it is illegal to invade another country. We are horrified by the impacts of this aggression on the people of Ukraine, and particularly the many millions of women and children who have had to flee their homes, lost their lives, and suffered premature births, or whose health has been affected by the conflict. On the 5th of March, ACWW published a statement, along with Sir Optimist International and a series of other organizations, which we helped draft, which called for the immediate halt to hostilities, for all troops to be withdrawn, and for good faith, peaceful diplomatic negotiations to begin in neutral territory. The actions of states must place the good of citizens and humanity at their heart, and accordingly, all citizens must be protected. It went on to say that war is never gender neutral. Women and girls in all their diversity are always disproportionately affected by war, and it is no different in this context or conflict. The projections that millions will be displaced and will become refugees are being realized, with thousands fleeing daily. Many of those on the move are women and girls, and a specific targeted gender transformative program must be immediately developed and implemented to ensure that their lives, hopes, and dreams are not irreparably damaged by this war. No one at ACWW is under an illusion that public statements are going to end this conflict or this war. But it's been ACWW's policy for decades that we are not equipped to act in conflict zones or provide relief aid. This type of work requires very specific provisions, including specially trained staff, security, and resources, such as power generators and clean water, which ACWW is simply not equipped to provide. And doing so without these, a team from ACWW would just be more of a burden on the local population and the agencies seeking to make an impact, as we relied on them to help us. I think the nearest equivalent I can put that into in operational terms is, you are the WI. You have all organized events and had 5 too many people try and turn up and help at the last minute who weren't part of the plan, haven't been briefed, and decide that they're going to set up the stall, the tea, the afternoon, whatever it is, in a slightly different way than you've all planned and prepared for. And it's really unhelpful. Now scale that up whilst everyone's being shot at. It's a very specific and skilled type of response that we're just not able to offer. ACWW was founded in 1929 to be an organization that advocated for our members and to amplify their voices at international levels. This remains critical today, and it is exactly what we have been doing. So there's a bit of an update. At the United Nations, there are moves underway to challenge the Russian Federation's right to sit on the Security Council and thus hold a veto vote in deliberations. It's generally been accepted that when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russian Federation inherited the seat on the UN Security Council from the Soviet Union, but that was never actually written down anywhere. And it certainly wasn't updated in the UN Charter. So there are a lot of governments saying Russia doesn't have a seat at this table and we don't accept the legitimacy of their position. And if that is successful, it will have a significant impact. Firstly, Russia won't be able to veto decisions at the Security Council, which would include decisions around deployment of peacekeepers or other initiatives. But it would also remove Russia from other mechanisms, such as the Human Rights Council. And generally, these things need a motion from the General Assembly to the Security Council. And if Russia can't veto that, then there's a much higher chance of that happening. And then thirdly, it would be a massive loss of status and have long-lasting implications for Putin's regime. It will be no surprise to anyone that one of the biggest factors in the current situation is ego, and fragile male ego. And so having that challenged on the international stage has a real value of its own. In terms of that weakening of Russia's stance at the UN, we've seen that even in the last 3 or 4 weeks. On the 3rd of March, a resolution was presented to the UN General Assembly, which demanded that Russia immediately, completely and unconditionally withdraw all of its military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. It was an unprecedented condemnation, and the call for action passed with 141 member states voting for it and only 5 against. And in the wake of that, Russia's ability to negotiate at the recent Commission on the Status of Women was significantly less high profile and significantly weaker. ACWW was taking part in the negotiations of the agreed conclusions via the UK government. And during those negotiations, we have seen that the text is stronger now than it has been in the last 15 years because Russia wasn't able to influence it in the same way. And again, to put that in context, imagine the UN as a dinner table or a school playground, a schoolyard. I think the example I used yesterday was, Russia tends to get up at the UN and say, this is what we want, this is what we think, do it. And then 4 or 5 client states, the countries that rely on Russia for survival, stand up and go, yeah, what he said. Well, if you take the bully out of the room, if you take the first person not standing up and saying it, those other 5 countries don't stand up and say, yeah, what he said, because no one said it. And they don't have the strength, and they don't actually have the conviction to stand up and say it themselves. They don't start that dialogue themselves. So it is a weaker position. We were ACW, in terms of ACWW's position, we were invited, we were one of only 16 NGOs invited to the Human Rights Council 3 weeks ago to attend a special session, which then the day before it was supposed to happen got cancelled because they had actually moved it from the Human Rights Council to the General Assembly to have that vote, which passed with 141 supporters. But globally, ACWW was one of only 16 organizations that were invited to that session. So we do have a seat at the table. We do have a role to play. And it's really critical that we do everything we can to make sure that that message is being heard. So next week, I will be attending a special emergency session of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, the FAO. And that session has been called by 49 member states to address the impacts on food security in Ukraine and across Europe resulting from the invasion. There's a small number of NGOs who have been invited to attend that. And we will use that opportunity to lobby member states to prioritize women from rural communities in the immediate response to the crisis and the reconstruction efforts that will follow. And that's not saying, please remember that rural women are important. That's saying, can you outline for me what your government's agenda is for reconstruction and how rural women are factored into that? Here is the legal obligation to make sure that they are included. Now show me your plan that shows me that you are meeting your legal obligations. We're fairly clear about the fact that governments have a legal obligation to look after or to provide for rural women. We've maintained, oh, sorry, I've skipped a paragraph. I know it may sound like a lot of talk and not much action, but it can and does have an impact on the Russian government, and hopefully a positive one on the peoples of both Russia and Ukraine. In October 2021, ACWW's World President, Mogdi Dekok, our Executive Director, Tish Collins, and myself had a meeting in Moscow with the Russian Minister for Rural Affairs. I mean, it's a diplomatic meeting. You have to be fairly civilized. But after the initial pleasantries, Tish asked some quite pointed and awkward questions about the care for widows in rural Russia. And then I asked him what the Russian government's response to the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against All Women, CEDAW, which many of you have heard me talk about in the past, you know, what Russia was actually doing on this important international treaty, and whether he, as the Minister for Rural Affairs, even engaged with it. And the answer was no. And I said, but you know that Article 14 is on rural women. No. Okay, so first of all, that's an embarrassment for him in a meeting, which is an uncomfortable thing. And there was, you know, shuffling of paper and conversations are going to be had internally. But we were then able to go and speak to our members in Russia and highlight this to them so that they can then challenge things through the legal processes. And that's, you know, what we try and do and support our members. But it also means that the government is being challenged by outsiders, which means that the women in the local community are safe, because they're not being seen to be challenging their own government directly. So it's not a fast process. It's not comprehensive, but we do whatever we can and are able to support our members and to hold governments to account. We've maintained contact with our friends and colleagues in Ukraine throughout the crisis, and wherever possible, we've signposted assistance. Our staff at Central Office have personally made donations of warm clothes for children and babies to a local Polish community centre, which was able to get stuff directly to the Polish border to support women and children as they reached it. And whenever we've been contacted at Central Office, we've encouraged members who want to take immediate action to donate to UNICEF or the Red Cross or other aid organizations who are working on the ground. We've also, of course, said, you know, please support ACWW's continued advocacy efforts. In the World President's letter, there are 2 points that she makes that I'd like to just bring to this meeting, because I think it's important in terms of some of the discussions and conversations that have been had recently. And they're not necessarily comfortable points to hear, but they are important. So the first is that ACWW has a large member organization in the Russian Federation, which is the Women's Union of Russia. With more than 1 million women in rural communities all across the country, the Women's Union of Russia do their best to provide support to women in very difficult circumstances and an environment which is at best hostile to women. The legalization of domestic violence, refusal to sign or ratify the Istanbul Convention, and repeated breaches of international human rights law all put Russian women at risk. We continue to stand in solidarity with our members in Russia who have no part in this war, have no desire for it to have happened, and have no ability to stop it. We've received reports in the last week that nappies or diapers, whatever they're called in Canada, I should have checked yesterday when I didn't know, and baby products have gone up in price more than 800% in Russian cities. So you can imagine what impact that's having in rural communities where they're much more scarce. At no point does that detract from the suffering of Ukrainian women and their families. But we have to also remember that wars of aggression are waged by men and cause suffering for women. You know, this war wasn't started by a woman in a rural community in Russia. The second point is that on the 21st of March, we issued a statement for the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And in it, we said that the current crisis in Ukraine has created a near global movement of political and emotional solidarity with the people of that nation who are suffering the impacts of an illegal invasion. Though we recognise that this is appropriate and reasonable, we also recognise that the attitudes of Western and global North states have not been as sympathetic when those affected by conflicts in other regions have looked different. Refugees, internally displaced persons fleeing conflicts in Africa and the Middle East continue to receive a frosty reception in many Western nations. ACWW urges all governments to stand with all of those affected by conflict, regardless of their country of origin, their ethnic background, or their colour. Again, it's not to diminish the severity of the situation in Ukraine, but we have to remember that the situation in South Sudan, the situation in Yemen, the situation in Darfur haven't finished. They haven't been resolved, and people are objecting to supporting refugees from those communities all over the world. We remain committed to peace building, and to the needs of rural women. And so hopefully that's given a bit of an overview and some clarity about ACWW's position. I'm very happy to take any and all questions. And if there was anyone who was here yesterday who thought I said something helpful that I haven't said today, please remind me and I will happily speak for probably too long on that subject, as I tend to. Thank you.
Are there any questions out there? Excuse me, I'm trying to go. Yes, Judy. You're muted, Judy.
Are there groups in Ukraine itself that are under ACWW?
So there are no member societies. There are individual women who are, I think we have 2 individual members, who neither of whom are now in Ukraine. They've both been able to get to safety. We've stayed in touch with them throughout. And we are in touch with lots of women in Ukraine who we work with regularly, but aren't members, you know, that we've met variously, and have a good working relationship with, and we're staying in touch with them whenever possible. We had intended for International Women's Day to have an event where we gave an open space for 5 Ukrainian women to speak on their kind of current situation. One was unable to join us because she was literally in an air raid shelter and couldn't get enough battery to charge her phone to be able to speak. And the other 3 didn't feel safe. We know that one of our colleagues is on a death list and is banned in Russia. And so if caught, she will suffer significantly. And, you know, so we have to be incredibly careful with what we share and what we put online. And I think that reflects also in Russia. You know, we work with the Women's Union of Russia. We know the women who work there. We know their members. We know their staff, you know, and they speak very differently when they're in Russia and when they're in other countries about the situation, because they're not being listened to. But the building that the Women's Union of Russia is based in is owned by the Russian government. They are not allowed to speak against the Russian government for fear of reprisal. And you know, there are some young women with young families, and there are some older women with older families who work there, and who will, you know, if domestic violence is legal in a country, then you can imagine what happens when people criticize the government. You know, we have to be very careful, not just what ACWW says publicly, but also what our members say publicly, because it has an impact on other members. And, you know, our priority is always going to be keeping those members safe. So it's a really difficult situation. But we are maintaining contact with everyone we can in Ukraine and in Russia throughout this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
Is there anyone else that would like ask a question of Nick?
I do.
Bianca?
Yes, I would like to ask if ACWW has a viewpoint about the sanctions that have been brought against Russia by the UN, NATO, EU, leaders of the free world, etc.
So formally, no. We don't have an official position. You may or may not know that the way ACWW works is that we have our policies are always based on the resolutions that our members pass at world conferences. So we have a limited scope. I'm not allowed to speak in public on issues that we don't have policy on in general. The reason we can speak on this situation is because we have clear policy in support of both the UN Charter and against war. So actually you could switch out almost any country and we could speak to this point. In terms of a kind of a general geopolitical view, are sanctions proving fully effective? No. Is Russia still doing what it's doing? Yes. Is it getting harder? Is it putting pressure on? Yes, undoubtedly. Is that impacting average usual Russians? Yes, undoubtedly. Is that affecting them more than Putin? Probably. From my own experience of being in Moscow and being inside the having a tour of the Kremlin, and suddenly everything stops because Putin has got in his helicopter and is leaving his one specific building within the Kremlin and going somewhere, and so everything in the whole of Moscow stops whilst this happens. I don't know if you saw the pictures early on in the invasion where on this ridiculously long table, the French Prime Minister is at one end and Putin is at the other, and everyone's going on about this being a power play. I don't think it was. We were at an event in October in Russia. The man is terrified of COVID. Everyone was being COVID tested every day to get into the conference and had to have additional COVID tests. Tish and the world president had to have additional COVID tests to go into the special session that he was going to be at. No one ever got within 20 feet of him. And it came out afterwards that the French Prime Minister president had actually said, well, I refused to take a Russian COVID test because I didn't want them to have a sample of my DNA, which I don't think is unwise. And with the reports coming out about negotiators being poisoned, probably sticking a Russian COVID test in your mouth and up your nose is not the best of ideas at the moment. It may have a slight aroma of polonium, but the reality is that Vladimir Putin lives a life completely disconnected from the reality of his people. And I think there's a very good chance that the sanctions are having enough of an impact on the people around Putin that eventually someone will say enough is enough. But I suspect they're going to have had a much more brutal impact on civilians who had nothing to do with this in the long run, and do a lot more damage to the Russian economy long run. Which, when you are a billionaire and you have trillions of dollars squirreled away that you've stolen from the country that you're supposed to be ruling, is it going to make much difference? Probably not. We've seen in Europe the super yachts that have been taken off people. It's their second or third super yacht. It's not like, oh no, I can't get to work now that my $5 billion boat has been taken off me. So yeah, officially we don't have a position. Personally, I'm always of a mixed mind. I think the other problem is, what do you do if you don't sanction? You can't invade. You can't say, well, stop it, naughty. So you use sanctions. I don't know what the other alternatives are that would really work. But at some point in the future, I have got a good anecdote about Russian super yachts and being a total waste of money that I'll save for another occasion.
Can I answer back?
Please.
I think we all agree that the best way to help women of the world, because it isn't just Russian women or Ukrainian women, it is going to be women all over the world who are under Oh, extra hardship, whether it's increased tax prices, gas prices or whatever. But I'm thinking that stopping the war is the best way to help the women and other citizens. And I'm not, as you say, I'm not seeing an alternative to sanctions that might put pressure on Putin to get back to negotiating, because negotiating is what needs to happen. But I just don't see any other options at the moment.
No, I think you're right. And I think actually, you know, one of the points that we discussed yesterday was the really critical thing here is that every government outside the immediate region can play a role here. The UK government 10 days ago said we must stop relying on Putin for hydrocarbons. You know, he's a war criminal, he's a this, he's a that, and immediately got on a plane to go negotiate a new gas deal with, or a new oil deal with Saudi Arabia, you know, who the Saudi Arabian government are bombing civilians in Yemen. They are committing war crimes. They are committing atrocities. They are breaking international human rights law specifically to do with women. So what we need to do is pressure our governments internally to basically grow up and act better. You know, stop doing deals with governments who are going to be the next problem state. You know, it's that simple. You know, the Americans thought it was great that the Afghans took on the Soviet Union, so they gave the Afghans loads of weapons. As soon as the Soviets had gone, someone else moved in, and suddenly America has to invade you, or decide they have to invade Afghanistan for the next 20 years. You know, meanwhile, every client state in the world, you know, Russia right now is full of Chechens who learnt to hate the West because of the West's behavior and its ability to always prioritize its own interests. And I think at a certain point, our governments need to prioritize the interests of our people and not themselves. And that's, you know, again, it seems like work towards the Sustainable Development Goals is a vague way of approaching it, but global equity is the only way things are going to change, and that's what we have to work towards. And frankly, I can't remember a war of aggression waged by a woman leader in the last 800 years. I don't know if anyone else can point at one, but you know, after the genocide in Rwanda now has the highest level of female representation in its elected parliament of any country in the world. And in a country that has had tribal conflict for hundreds of years, has now established significant peace. So I think sanctions are an immediate response to a situation. Of course they are, but we need political change. We need, and someone pointed out yesterday, you know, we talk about our organizations not being political, and I'm not going to speak for the WI, and I'm certainly not going to put words in people's mouths, but we at ACWW see ourselves as non-partisan rather than non-political, because these things are political issues. Women's equality is a political issue, and we're kidding ourselves if we pretend it's not. So, you know, think when you're at the ballot box, think when you, I don't even know in Canada whether you elect judges like they do in the US, but you know, but if they do, consider the next time, you know, consider the records of your politicians, of your judges, of whoever it is you're electing. What are their actions towards good practice and what are their actions towards bad practice? Because these people move up through government. You know, I saw a video this morning which was talking about the last time NATO and Russia nearly came to blows in Pristina in Kosovo in the early mid 90s, late 90s, over the civil war in Kosovo. And there was this, it must have been early 90s, because there's this video of Yeltsin sat there and his deputy prime minister, Vladimir Putin. You know, it's not a surprise that people who like conflict stay liking conflict, because it elevates them to higher positions of power. So I think, you know, sanctions at the moment are what can be done. But I think we also need to evaluate what actions we take in our own communities and what leaders we put in power around us, because their decisions have a global impact.
I agree with you. Change is slow, and I guess all I'm seeing are sanctions. But anyway, thank you very much.
Hi, is it Mary?
Yes. Hello, Nick. I'm just wondering about if a society like FWIO is a society. Now, I know that we can all, as individuals, make donations or send support through different agencies. But I guess one of the issues that seems to be talked about is the contravention of the principles of our society and also our own WI, that we don't discriminate one group of women against another. So is it appropriate for a society like FWIO to make a donation from FWIO, or is it just more prudent for if anybody wants to offer assistance, they could do it as individuals?
I think that would have to be a question for FWIO. I'm not going to interfere in the internal mechanisms. I don't know your constitution. I don't know your setup.
But we are members of ACWW. So as a society, is there any comment on that?
So what I would say is there are an awful lot of places in the world that need help, and inevitably anyone giving any help to one is choosing to prioritize one over another. You know, that's reality, and that's fair enough. I would say, and I mentioned, and forgive me, Mary, this is a slightly roundabout answer, but I'm trying to get to your point.
That's fair.
One of the points I made yesterday on the call was ACWW is changing a lot of the way it works globally at the moment, and we have some really exciting things which will be hitting your doorstep shortly in the magazine, but also you'll see on the website. And one of those is the way that our development projects work. We are trying to address the systemic problems that these situations escalate out of. So, for example, we'll be working with a Canadian company, a big tech company, we've done our due diligence. They are a good, solid group of people who are trying to do the right thing. And they are going to be financially supporting ACWW, but they are also going to be doing some deliverable impact work with us. So working with rural communities to ensure they have internet access, that they have financial independence, that they have financial literacy training, that they have entrepreneurship skills, because whether it's domestic violence or whether it's international violence, women having independent financial security is going to be a critical pathway to peace. So what I would say is, if members in FWIO choose to put their donations in the hands of ACWW to look long-term at systematic change, we would certainly encourage that. We think that's a good thing to do. And we're very clear about how money is spent, and we're very transparent about that. We cannot, if we receive donations that someone say, this is the donation to ACWW, but I only want it to go to Ukraine, we will have to return that donation, because we can't accept that. But what we are looking at is the project. So we're starting a new project in Papua New Guinea in May, which this Canadian company we are working with are seeing as a pilot program to see scale. What they have told us they want to do is to see this program succeed, scale it up, and then deploy it in Ukraine to help rebuild communities there and to have a real impact for rural women in Ukraine. Now, how involved ACWW is going to be in that directly will depend on all of the things I said earlier in terms of security and ability to make sure we're not being a burden. But what we have done is design and create that program that will be deployed in Ukraine. So we are helping, but we're not doing the kind of restricted, where you can spend this, but only on this one thing in this one country. If FWIO wanted to donate more specifically to something directly in Ukraine, again, that would have to be for you all to decide through whatever mechanisms you do that. I don't want to interfere in
But
telling
not
you,
through ACWW. Yeah.
but you know, you can't send us money and then ask us to put it directly into Ukraine or to send it to another society.
Okay.
Obviously, what FWIO chooses to do is their choice. The only thing I would say is that a huge amount of money gets spent in emergency aid, and every government on the planet has an emergency aid budget of billions and billions, and that you see mobilized, you know, whether that gets turned into guns or whether that gets turned into food parcels. We have seen a global effort mobilize billions of dollars in the last 2 months to Ukraine. What really struggles is the follow-up, because there will always be the next crisis. So not because I want to continue having a job, but because I think it's the right thing to do. What I would encourage you to do is look at the people who are doing the long-term work to change the situation and to change realities. And whether that is someone directly in Ukraine, like the Red Cross or like the UNICEF, or whether that is someone like ACWW who is doing more broad scale work. I think it's the long-term impact, and it's the long-term reality that has to change. You know, you can stick your finger in the dam, but part of you has to be thinking, well, what concrete are we going to be pouring in this hole next? To mix my metaphors completely. So I hope that answers the question, but I'm always wary of telling member societies what they should do with their hard-earned money.
No, you actually, yeah, no, that's good. Now I understand better how that, yeah, you did answer the question. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Is there anyone else?
If you want to hear a silly story about a Russian super yacht. 2 people nodded. Everyone can leave the call if they've had enough of me. So I was on holiday last year. I managed to escape the UK for a very brief period in between our various lockdowns. And 4 of us had waited to the last minute and then taken a very, very silly decision that we were going to try and go sailing. Hadn't been for a while. Grabbed a last minute cheap deal to go to Greece. We've had a couple of days sailing. It's all been great. We're then sat in a little fishing town, or there's a fishing town, and then just around the corner, there's a little town called Fiscado, village called Fiscado, which is inevitably full of rich Europeans on holiday, normally full of football or soccer players, and Russians. And we'd stopped off for dinner, and we were sat in this restaurant eating whatever it was, grilled pork and nice roasted vegetables. And we can see in the bay, there's this almighty and ugly thing that is clearly, you know, some billionaire's plaything. It's glass and black, and you don't want black boats. They get too hot. It's just stupid, but it's imposing, and it's a big show of masculine strength. And it's sat in the bay. And then from this boat comes out a little motor tender. I say a little. So 4 of us were sailing on a 38-foot yacht. This motor tender was 42 feet long. And its job was purely to get people from shore onto the big boat. So it comes out, and the crew on this thing, 4 of them, are coming in to try and moor up at the landing. They're obviously collecting the boss, and they can't get close enough because there's other boats moored up in the way, and it's a huge boat in the grand scheme of the space they're trying to get into. So then that boat goes offshore about 35 feet. I don't know what that is in meters, I'm sorry, 10 meters, let's call it. And another smaller boat comes out of this big. Now, I'm assuming we assumed this was a Russian boat at this stage because it was acting like a Russian doll, and smaller boats just kept appearing out of this huge monstrosity. And so this little speedboat comes out, goes past the tender, which is now 10 meters offshore, and comes into land. And then this guy who just looks so unimpressed with the whole process is stood there with a woman in a beautiful dress, and they step onto this small motorboat. And they drive literally 10 meters to the tender to get on the small boat onto the medium boat, so they can then go the extra 150 meters to the big boat. Why they didn't just stay on the little boat, I've no idea, obviously a stage thing. And they carry on. The big boat has LED lights in the back of the steps up onto the back of the boat, so bright that the entire bay is lit. You know, we were eating our dinner at 8 p.m. in daylight because of this thing. And we're all just sat there thinking, if I owned this huge boat and my skipper had decided to put the medium boat into a space it didn't fit, I'd be really questioning their expertise, especially when I then have to get off a small boat onto a medium boat onto the big boat. Anyway, we looked up this boat because we were just, who on earth is this idiot? It's Roman Abramovich, who you're not in the UK, so you may not know or care who owns Chelsea Football Club, but he is the Russian oligarch who, until last week, owned Chelsea Football Club, who maintained that he didn't know Vladimir Putin, that he had no relationship with him, that there was no background, and suddenly appears in the negotiation sessions in Turkey, leading the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. And then the next morning wakes up having been poisoned because he's obviously done the wrong thing. And so they've poisoned him with some biological agent. But it just proves to show, only put small boats in small holes. I'm not sure that that's the grand message on peace, but, you know, appropriate use of appropriate things, to link it back to Bianca's question on sanctions. I think we've got to do what we can do. But the separation of reality from the super rich in Russia is really significant. You know, there was a question yesterday about, you know, how do we know what to believe? How do we know what we hear in the press and what's real? And I know that there are Russians out there who have no clue what the reality is because they are fed a constant line from their state press on the reality. And I think the only thing that I can compare that to in any way that normal people understand is if you had spent 2019 watching Fox News and CNN and the contrasting positions there. You know, they were two different worlds. They weren't interpretations of the same events. They were different worlds. And so I think, you know, we have to be aware that the Russian people don't know what is going on. And I think it's really difficult. You know, we must be very careful not to penalize average normal people who have no control over what's happening in their country, for things that they can't influence. You know, I said yesterday, I have an ex-girlfriend in Russia who's been arrested 3 times in the last month for protesting against the war. And, you know, she's doing what she thinks is the right thing to do. She's joining protests. She's using digital communications to get the word out to people. And she's suffering for it. So I think we have to always remember that there are human beings on both sides, who aren't in charge of what's going on. Looks like everyone's ready for lunch again.
All right, if there's no further questions, don't see anybody's hands up. Okay, well, Nick, Thank you so much for taking the time to converse with us once again today, sharing your experiences in the role of as the advocacy director of ACW. You have brought a clarity and enlightened us with an overview of what ACW is doing in relation to the invasion of Ukraine and how ACWW is advocating for women on a global level. Thank you. Also, I want to extend a thank you for coming to Trish Collins, Executive Director of ACWW, and Linda Hoy, Canadian Area ACWW President, and to all our visitors present today, and to the FWIO members. Thank you all for attending today's presentation and taking time out of your busy schedules. And I guess enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you so much, Nick, once again.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Can I just say thank you to Nick as well. Thank you, Nick, for being here. Your presentation was a lot better than what I could have presented it, because you're right there hands-on. And I really do thank you for taking the time both yesterday and today.
Thank you, Linda.
I'd like to say thank you to everyone that came out. It's Sandy Miller and I kind of instigated this whole event. And I absolutely appreciate everyone's time that they've taken out of their days. And I hope it was informative for everyone.
Thank you, Sandy. Okay, at this time, I'm going to stop the recording.
So